So my name is Keillen Curtis, and I will be presenting on community benefit agreements. I was asked by TCIA to talk a little bit about development in the community. So I know a lot of the talks have been around tech, and the CBA is more of a contractual physical thing, but this often intersects a lot with tech because you're in the community, and depending on community development can very much affect the way in which you interact with other people. It also affects what your access is, if you even have access to technology. And also in terms of technology, we're trying to figure out ways that we can use tech to inform the community, especially when there's development. So today I will be presenting by myself. My co-host was not able to make it because of some family circumstances, and so we hope that everything's okay. So we'll go to the next slide. This is the basic outline I want to go through today. And so it's not exhaustive, it's not comprehensive. This is going to be kind of a high level presentation. And so if you guys have questions, please leave it in the chat and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Or you can follow up with me on an email if you have any specific things that you want to know more about, or if there's a development that you have going on. So we can walk through the outline real quick. So the first thing is just going to be, what is a CBA? What's the history of CBA? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Why a CBA? We'll also walk through a CBA example. The one that we'll use is for Facebook in Menlo Park. Then we'll go through the benefits of the community. And this is one of the areas I would like you guys to be interactive with, is talking about the benefits, because one of the issues that often happens is, how do we define what a benefit to the community is? Who defines those? So in that section, I would like you guys to really chime in so that we can have a good discussion. And then in the last section, we're just going to talk about alternatives, and then I'll wrap up. So let's start with, what is a CBA? So CBA is just a community benefit agreement. It's essentially a contract where a developer who's coming in to do some development very often will get some sort of subsidy, very often, or what people call TIF. And generally, community groups have organized to say, if you're going to give this money to this developer, which is taxpayer funded money, we think we should have some input. And we think that we should be able to have a say about what's going on in our neighborhood. And within the CBA, there can be more than one developer. So for instance, in the Facebook example I'll show you later, there are several signatories, or people who signed on the dotted line to talk about the development. And so it's not always one developer and then the community. Sometimes it can be several developers. And in fact, in some of these CBAs, one developer may start the project and may get bought out or run out of money, and another developer steps in. Now, generally, the government does not get into the negotiations of a CBA, which is what surprises a lot of people. The government generally will approve it or approve the project, but typically you won't see the government sign off. Now, there are some CBAs where the local municipality will sign off or will play a role, but because it needs to be enforced, generally the government does not want to get involved in negotiation and prefer it to be a contract simply between the community groups and the developer itself. So the history is, the CBA really came about in the late 90s, early 2000s. One of the more famous examples was Atlantic Yards, and that was in Brooklyn. And so in that example, there was a lot of community anxiety around traffic, around jobs, around housing development. And so several community groups got together and said, hey, how can we influence this development before it displaces, gentrifies, and has negative effects on our community? And Atlantic Yards was one of the more famous CBAs, and there were many people who modeled off of Atlantic Yards, but it also has evolved into different types of CBAs that have gotten more comprehensive as there's been trial and error with communities. Now, one of the quotes I wanted people to think about was from a law review article by Edward Barbieri, and so I'll just read it and you can read along with me. The CBA movement has its roots in the early 2000s with efforts to win living wages, local hiring, and green building requirements for low-income communities that traditionally have suffered both environmentally and economically. The LA Live CBA in Los Angeles in 2001 is considered the first major CBA benefiting low-income community residents. By contrast, high-income communities, often in suburban areas, have used land use mechanisms like zoning laws and local ordinances to exclude certain undesirable land uses. Because of their existing power, high-income communities have not needed CBAs as a tool. Yet, as discussed below, CBAs are being used in high-income communities, including those in California's Silicon Valley, to create affordable housing funds and focus resources on low and mixed income housing development. So I want to stop there and just chime in that we know that CBAs tend not to be used very often in affluent or high-income areas. They tend to have preset rules and regulations that won't even allow for certain things. And some of you guys may have heard on the news throughout the nation where low-income housing is going in, or something that would be for the benefit of certain communities, and they will point out to rules that are already in place versus many low-income areas where they don't have the same rules in place, and so they have to negotiate with the developer coming in. There are three main ones I really wanted to highlight, and you guys can look at these once you're ready. But as I talked about, Atlantic Yards is one. And for a lot of people, they're surprised that Facebook actually has one in Menlo Park, which we'll actually go through. And so I'm going to switch screens and we'll walk through the Facebook example. Also, Los Angeles has one that is very readily available. You can go to LAX website and find this. Some of the other CBAs are a little bit hard to find, although they're public documents. Not everyone continues to host them, and so you'll have to find them on other people's servers. And I would encourage you, if you are interested in looking at CBAs, there are quite a few law review articles that will categorize the CBAs by benefits, by developers, by region, by what was accomplished, by the detriment. And so if you have any interest, I can certainly provide some links for you to look at. So before we walk through the Facebook part, I like this to be a little interactive. How do you guys define your community? So please put in the chat, how do you guys define community? How do you define your community? Oh, we have a question. Let me answer this one. Who needs a CBA when you have a homeowners association? Well, let's address that question real quick. So an HOA generally goes to simply the development that you live in, and the rules would apply to the home and the neighbors that are in that development. A CBA can be more comprehensive. So if the entire block is saying, hey, we're involved, and the blocks next to it, well, they may not be part of a homeowners association. So you can literally cross the street and a new development, a new mall, a new stadium's going up. And so you'll need rules about everything from traffic to new centers to who gets the job. So that would be the difference between an HOA and a CBA. A CBA tends to be more comprehensive in geographic scope. Okay, we have someone in the chat saying, community equals people who share stakes in issues that I have a stake in. That's a very interesting take. What do you guys think about the other definitions that people have? So you could have, okay, here's another one. Having just moved to central Minnesota to be with my mom, I can definitely say length of residency defines community up here. Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting one. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because this can be a source of contention among people, because you could have a neighborhood, and depending on the state you're in, block by block, it could look very different, from income to architecture to traffic flow, all of those things. And so when you're trying to do a CBA, the question becomes, who represents the community? And so there are some established guidelines, as we'll look at the Facebook example, but sometimes there is no agreement, because I could live on one block that could be high income, and someone else could live on another block and be low income. Someone else could define their religious affiliation, saying, this is my community. Anyone outside of here, I don't want to deal with you. I don't want this in my neighborhood. Length of residency is another one. That can be a big one if you know your neighbors or not, because your interests may be different than someone else that lives in the same neighborhood saying, I went to high school with these people. Our families have known each other for 3 generations. We don't want this development. And as you guys have seen in many other states where people have moved after the pandemic, you may have different interests. And even politically, if some states become blue, some become red, are we a community? And who speaks for us? All right, the next one, let's see. The right last name, okay. My community is defined by family relations, location, race, and common interest. So let's unpack those a little bit. So the first one is family relations, okay. So that kind of says that no matter where your family is, they're still part of your community, okay. Location, so geographic based, okay. Race also determines your community, and common interest. Okay, that's a really good definition. I like that. Okay. Um, Anyone else want to chime in on how they define their community? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about a few of the things that have been gained in the past, and then we'll jump into the Facebook example. So feel free to ask questions about any of this. And the reason I put potentially on there is that not all these things come to fruition. Sometimes you will have a contract that will lay out things and lay out metrics and timelines, but some of those things don't come into effect if you're not vigilant and upfront looking to figure out what can we reasonably attain from this, and do we have the power and staff to continue to watch. And so here are some of the top ones. So there's lists and lists and lists of different benefits depending on the geographic area. But one is tech centers. So for a lot of low income places, they are looking for ways to do tech centers where you can access computers, where you'll have innovation hubs, all sorts of things that they want to bring development to their community. Jobs programs is a huge one, because as you know, when a developer comes in, there's going to be construction, but not just construction, there will be supplies, there'll be people shopping there, eating, traveling. And so the question becomes, how do our neighbors and the residents take advantage, and there's not simply an outflow of money from the community? Business development, that's another huge one. When for instance, let's say Atlantic Yards came in with the new stadium in Brooklyn, the jobs program and business development were huge because they wanted people to work there. But then they also said, what about the people here who are entrepreneurs or parts of small businesses? Will you bank with our local bank? Will you eat at our local restaurants? Will you hire my nephew, my niece? All those things were extremely important. Another large one is low income housing, because very often on a large project, you're going to get displaced. And that could be directly or indirectly. Directly, if I'm taking your property; indirectly, if traffic is very, very bad, or if I'm creating a building that's going to be blocking even sunlight out, right? And so there may be people who voluntarily leave, saying, now there's a lot of traffic here because of the increased population, the increased business development here. Either I may leave because I don't want to deal with it, or in some examples, what happens when your property value goes up, and let's say you're on a fixed income and you can no longer afford to live in that neighborhood because of property taxes. Environmental justice is another one. In many CBAs, sometimes there is environmental hazards, and they can call for remediation. Or environmental justice can talk about how are we developing the building or the complex. Are we using LEED standards? Are we using solar, wind? How are you powering these things? What about traffic? Can we figure out ways to mitigate pollution as we know there's going to be increased traffic. And so some people have used the CBA to figure out ways to increase environmental justice, including just giving people knowledge about what they can do to cut back on pollution and leave a better earth to their children. Community organization funding, that's another big one, because very often in CBAs, the community is represented by community groups, especially nonprofits, especially 501c3s. So let me clarify there. So when we say community organization funding, it is not equal to nonprofit, not equal to 501c3. And people very often think that, and that is generally the case. But sometimes there are just coalitions who get together and they don't file anything with the government. They simply say, hey, we, the group in South Minneapolis are coming together to talk about this. We'll hold meetings, but we're not necessarily looking to incorporate. So when we talk about community organization funding, we are saying, yes, nonprofits, 501c3s, but it may be grassroots activism. And so part of what keeps the engine going is sometimes we need money. We need to produce flyers or emails or get consultants to talk about this, to weigh in. And so very often in CBAs, they will include funding. Now, we'll talk about some of the pitfalls of taking funding, but that's one of the things that's very often asked for. Another major thing that people ask for are parks and green spaces. So when people are doing redevelopments, they are often saying, hey, how can we imagine this area, especially if it's dilapidated or if it's an area where people have moved away. Very often they'll say, we want a park for our children or a park for our elderly. We want green spaces. We don't simply want it to be a series of buildings and complexes and it's very industrial looking, but there's no earth or nature that is involved in this development. So now I'm going to switch to the Facebook CBA. So if you guys have any questions, please let me know right now before we move on. Okay. So now this is the Facebook CBA. I want to make sure everyone can see it. I'm going to go to full screen. All right. So this one is the 2016 Facebook CBA. Can everyone see it? You can give me no. Okay, let's try it again.
It's not sharing.
Okay, let me try to stop sharing. Okay, can you see it now? Okay, excellent. All right. So as you guys have questions, please let me know. So this was Facebook CBA, and I think there are some good things in there. And as you see, as I go down, there will be some notes that I made. I've highlighted some things, and then some things are just in red because they were curious things for me. So as we talked about within this, you can see that this is what the parties desired to have. There were three main goals in here. First one, housing development and preservation, okay? And they created a group and a fund called Catalyst in which they would look for community housing and low-income housing. The second thing was economic opportunity. So they were looking for a way to have training as well as job creation within the community. Some of it was through Facebook, but a lot of it was external businesses that were going to be developed around the new Facebook headquarters in Menlo Park. The last one was tenant assistance, because they recognized from other CBAs that as developers came in, as we talked about, very often there is displacement, whether that's voluntarily, people leaving saying, this is no longer my neighborhood, property taxes going up, if there is disruption in the neighborhood that people are no longer able to tolerate as the construction is going on. And so this was one of the things that they asked for was dollars to help people both relocate and to mitigate much of the issues that were going on. So Give me 1 second, it's not scrolling. Okay, next one. Here are the commitments that Facebook had. And so we'll just read through these quickly. To advance the shared goals of the community benefit, they basically said, we're willing to put up money. And I'll show you the number later, but if anyone wants to guess how much money they put up for these, please put it in the chat. How much would you guess that Facebook, one of the largest companies in the world, put up for these funds? Anyone want to take a guess? Okay. The next part I want to look at is the community group's commitments. And so one of the things that I found interesting was the legalese as an attorney. And so I just want to read through it. So one of the things they asked from the community was they would not file any complaint, petition, or anything in the courts that would challenge the approval. And keep this in the back of your head because we're going to come back to this because there's another provision I want you guys to take a look at, okay? So one of the other issues that comes about that we talked about was how do you make a decision? Oh, there's something in the chat. Let's see. Okay, 1 million. Keep going. Keep going. It was more than 1 million. So once they had this as a group, and I'll talk a little bit about how they came together as a group, they basically said we have to make voluntary and group decisions. And so as you can see what's highlighted there, Faith in Action Bay Area, they're one of the larger nonprofits in that area that very often is both a community participant and a consultant to community benefit agreements, the CBAs. And one of the things I found very interesting was there is a default and you were given 30 days. And I certainly understand that things need to be timely, but as you guys know, sometimes 30 days just isn't enough to come to consensus about very much. And so I found that very interesting that there was a little bit of dictation to the community that you have 30 days to figure this out. And if you don't figure this out, this becomes the default. The next part is the committee. So essentially what they have is they identified a bunch of community groups and they said, we want you guys to work things out and we'll do it through a committee style. So no one nonprofit, community group, 501c3 can make any decisions for anyone else. And sometimes that can be a good thing, right? But sometimes it can also be an issue if you have purposefully selected community groups that are not in alignment. So when we were talking about community earlier, what if we have two religious groups that oppose each other? Or we have two different groups that based on income don't see eye to eye, or two political groups that don't see eye to eye. Now, in terms of enforcement, I thought this was a good area because they're saying that before we have a dispute, we have to basically meet in person, put whatever issue you have in writing, and then give it up to 60 days to try to figure out what the issue is. So I definitely commend them on having that as a provision. Now, I put a couple of notes in there, as you guys can see, as I was reading through this. All right, let me check the chat real quick. Okay, it says, I feel like any finite amount, regardless of how large, benefits Facebook. It's a one-time expense, and then they're free to do what they want. Okay, I could certainly see that. I could certainly see that. So when we look at remedies, in no circumstances, let's emphasize again, in no circumstances shall monetary damages be available as a remedy for violations of this community compact. And so I won't make a whole lot of compact. I'll let you draw your own conclusion on that. But another thing I found interesting, especially for small groups, is how many of you guys really use mail that often these days, especially when email is free? So as I was reading through this, I thought to myself, you know, this could be a good thing in terms of you got notice because you have to mail it and email it. But for some community groups, what if you get a lot of requests that you need to give certain notices or take action, and that amount starts to add up? Or simply having to take action whenever requested, you have to take time out of your day. I can't send an email, I can't fax. I have to do certified or registered mail. And a lot of them don't have postal machines, which means they have to go to the post office in order to fulfill this condition. And I also have to come out of my own budget to constantly mail or use a courier for many of these things. Now, here were the groups that came together, the larger groups that came together, and you guys can Google them, at your leisure to see what they're doing. But they have done quite a bit of good work in that area to try to advance the community. And here's the name again, Dr. Jennifer Martinez. Remember, she was the one that it would default to if within 30 days the community groups could not come to a resolution. And so I don't know the politics around it. I haven't really looked it up, but it does look interesting in terms of having a community, but then defaulting to one group. Here's some other people. Here are the lawyers that were involved, the ACLU, they're involved. Julian Gross, he'll be in my other slide. He does a lot about CBAs throughout the nation. I would certainly encourage you to look at his website. He has some really good tips as well as some really good critiques of CBAs, what's possible with them and what's not. Now, as I talked about earlier, this is kind of the interesting thing where you have Facebook and then including Hibiscus property. So remember what I said, is usually between community groups and at least one developer. So I won't get too much into what Hibiscus is, but just so you guys see it, it's not just Facebook there. So there could be more than one person that you're trying to negotiate with while the community is trying to negotiate within itself, which adds another layer to this. So another thing that I found interesting in this CBA is the community groups may not voluntarily or by operation of law assign this community compact or any interest therein to any other party without Facebook's prior written consent, which may be withheld in Facebook's sole and absolute discretion. So let's talk about that language for a little bit. So you'll generally see this in a lot of contracts, especially around mergers, acquisitions, as well as leases. And the language you generally see with community groups is either there's going to be a conversation around it, or the person that has the determining power will say, will not be unreasonably withheld. Meaning if I merge with another nonprofit, or this nonprofit's going out of business, dissolving, and the board is now forming a new nonprofit, you typically would want to see some language saying, Facebook will not unreasonably withhold this, not in sole and absolute discretion, meaning they can say no for any reason. And quite frankly, they don't have to give you a reason why they said no. And so if you're a nonprofit that's winding up, the question becomes, what do you do if you were one of the voting members? If the nonprofit, after several years, let's say that there's no longer participation there, which happens with a lot of nonprofits, that people are very enthusiastic when it first begins, but sometimes 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later, you don't have the same people interested in remaining in that organization, in that nonprofit. And so the question becomes, so what do we do now? And I don't have an answer for that one. The next section I want to take a look at is when I was talking about mailing and using email, this is one of the areas where the community organizations need to be part of this. And as you can see, this is pretty comprehensive. So whenever notices are sent about how something should affect the community, imagine all of these things if Facebook says, I need you to tell us how you feel about this, or I need to send something out about approval to the government. So if you're running down the street every single day or every other day to mail something plus email it, sometimes things very well may get lost in the shuffle if the community group is not strong and has a good infrastructure and has very motivated people from the community to continue to look at what's going on, because as you guys know, in development, things can change, including environmental issues. So let's say they originally thought it was one way with the developers and the architect. And let's say for profit motive, they say, hey, we want to use a different type of material, which may or may not be harmful. Or we may use a different type of building, which could impact the soil for a very long time after the useful life of the complex or the building. And the question becomes, can you keep up with it? Do you want to keep up with these things? Do you want to get into the minutia of those things? And even if you want to get into the minutia of those things, do you have someone that can adequately explain it to you? All right, let's go to the chat. Okay, what potential is there for taking over, co-opting, winding down nonprofit partners for a particular agenda? You know, that is a good question. And what I would say is you would need someone to carefully draft provisions in the CBA to either allow for another nonprofit as long as it's in the same space, or let's say it comprises the same board or many of the same board members to be able to step in. But in this example, you know, it gets hard if you wanted to shift. Now, on the opposite end, because your question could mean more than one thing. If you're asking, does money get involved with nonprofits? Does funding get involved with nonprofits? Oh yeah, of course. I mean, there's all sorts of stories throughout the internet about CBAs where people might have started out with great intentions, but when you start seeing the timelines of we'll give each nonprofit $10,000, $5,000, $50,000 a year, and oh, by the way, let's say a bonus is coming up on the 10th year, where people may be jaded, people may be tired, and then you're given money to do your mission, and Facebook or any other group says, hey, remember that $100,000 we're giving you? We need you to vote this way. Absent the money, you may have voted a different way. But with the money or the resources, it is very possible that not only for this issue, right, the development, they could also ask you to speak nicely about their corporation, or to step in and talk about any issue that may have arisen in the news concerning issues about justice. So yeah, there is a potential for co-opting. There is a potential that Facebook or any other group could say, hey, what if we put some people on your board? We see that, you know, you guys aren't participating as much. We have some people that we think would be good, or the developer or the construction company could get on your board. And because they're the expert in the room, could be influencing. And I've actually seen that in the past where some nonprofits, the people aren't enthusiastic, and or you know, life happens and they're busy. And so sometimes when the expert in the room is giving an explanation, you may not ask a series of questions that may lead you to a different opinion. And you may simply say, you know, Keillen said it, I believe him, let's all vote on it. So, all right, so here are the signatures, as you guys can see. And they're done in several different pages. So they're basically joint and several, meaning they all constitute one agreement as long as we put them all together with the agreement. And some of these names may be familiar to you, some of them may not. All right, and then attachment A is just basically a compact. There's only a couple areas I really wanted to point out for you guys to think about. So one of the areas I thought was very, very interesting was when they say project approval without a challenge. So the funds were basically dependent on city council approving these things. And it was interesting because I said, this language right here, by who for what cause. I'm sorry, let me go back. Let's just read through it and then you guys can give me your opinion as I go through it. Facebook reserves the right to withhold half of the TE funding contribution, i.e. 7 million. So the total pot was 14 million. until the earlier of A, such time as litigation or referendum is resolved in a manner reasonably acceptable to Facebook, or B, Facebook's occupancy of any component of the project for business purposes. So had I been there, I think I would have asked a series of questions, because if I'm a community group on the less cynical side, how do I control anybody filing a lawsuit that would hold the funds? In my opinion, I might have asked, well, as long as no community group that's a signatory to this doesn't file a lawsuit, doesn't file a complaint, doesn't challenge, then the funds go. Now, if I put my cynical hat on, right, and this is pretty broad language that anyone can file a lawsuit, what if I have a dispute with the developer? What if I have a dispute with one of the suppliers? Does that mean these community groups then don't get that portion of the money until it's resolved? And as you guys know, litigation can literally go on for years. So what happens if this litigation goes on between two groups that may be very well buddy-buddy, saying we don't want to give out this money? And so you're going to institute a lawsuit based on pricing or schedule or this or that. And because we signed this language, they won't get any money. Then part B, if there is no litigation, what happens if Facebook never takes it for business purposes? And I looked at this document a couple of times, business purposes really isn't defined. So what if we put interns in there? What if we make it a community space where we're just observing people for data? Does that mean that the funding doesn't occur? And who's to tell them, hey, I think you're there for business purposes? What if I say I'm strictly there for research and development, for which we're not going to get any benefit for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? So just something interesting that I thought. Then the next part was just the funding schedule. So this isn't too unusual. 45 days after that satisfaction, they will begin doing the funding on this. And so it won't be upfront funding. It will be done in installments. So, and depending on how you look at it, you know, some people think, you know, you should just done the funding all up front so that the people that were at the table will still be there as the money is distributed. So this was another interesting provision within the CBA that I saw. And as we talked about earlier with litigation, one of the questions I had was, what if there's a valid reason that's not in the CBA? So as I talked about, let's say environmental justice. As you guys know, in Minnesota, there have been several challenges to different developments based on water rights, based on building materials, based on displacement. So what happens if the plan is deviated from, and the community group says, hey, everyone else is voting for this, but we feel like we need to stand up for our rights? So even if there's a valid quote unquote reason, they're saying, well, we can restrict funding if this does not happen. If you file a lawsuit challenging this, all the community groups can suffer and not get funded. So I think that was most of what I wanted to talk about. This was interesting language because, again, it's a little nebulous. What does that mean, act nimbly? It could mean 30 days, it could mean a year, depending on what the consultants tell them. I did like this part, help those most in need. But again, as they say, the devil's in the details. So the question is, how do we help them? Who's going to help them? Where does the funding go? How do we divvy up the funds? And sometimes that is an issue when CBAs are funded. Different people have different ideas about what that means, because I could say the businesses here are the most in need. Someone else could say residents are the most in need. Other people could talk about whatever interest that they bring with them to say that those are the most in need. And without it being defined, well, I don't know how you would determine that. One other thing that I found kind of interesting is if there was arbitration, it comes out of Facebook's funding. And I said it was good in the sense that the community groups didn't have to come up with their own money, but if someone challenged it, then you're essentially eating up the funds that could go to people that need it. So it's not as if Facebook is saying, hey, if you challenge this, we're going to pay for any arbitration mediation and the money's still there. They're saying if it's challenged, then we're going to use some of the funding contributions to pay for this. So could be a double-edged sword. Another interesting thing is selection of members, because this is very often is where people have the question, who is the community and how do we vote? When do we vote? All those things. So let's read through it. The advisory committee shall have at least 8 members, including 2 from East Palo Alto, 2 from the community groups, 2 from Facebook, and 2 from Menlo Park. So when you're thinking about that, the community group basically has 25% power, right, in this advisory committee. So Facebook, as well as the community group, have equal power. So really, the tiebreaker is going to be whoever is selected from the other communities. And then the question becomes, who selects them? And I'll leave that for you guys to think about. I'm going to stop here. If you guys have any questions, I can certainly go through this later, but I want to be respectful of time. So I'm going to stop this share and we're going to go back to the other screen. So let me go back and close that out. But if you guys have any questions in the meantime, I got to reload this file since I went out of it. But do you guys have any questions while I'm reloading this one? No questions? Any comments, concerns about this? Anything interesting that you guys found about this?
I'm curious, what do you think the levers are to normalize this, or normalize the best practices around this?
Yeah. So in terms of the CBA, I think part of it is having people who are knowledgeable about it and looking at what the community really needs. There are a lot of templates out there, and so I would encourage anyone that thinks a development is happening to obviously check with your local politicians or your city council, and then begin developing coalitions early on so that you are selecting the people that will be on the committee, because the committee of community groups will determine pretty much all the language, the enforcement, the monitoring of it. So what I would say is, number one, seek out those who have experience in it. Number two, become familiar with the CBA. And then number three, really define the benefits that you think the community needs. Because if someone else dictates to you or tells you, hey, we're gonna do a jobs program, but they never follow through on it, the question becomes, who is responsible for that? In terms of normalizing it, if you're saying, can we template it? Yes. There are a few different groups. And when I get back to my presentation, I will show you there's a couple of toolkits that I think are actually pretty good. So I also want to talk about the criticisms. And here are a few articles that you can look. So I'll just read through some of the criticisms that we can talk about. So the first one was from a local organization. So let's just read through it. One big problem with the community benefits agreements, experts say, is that they're not laws, but rather private contracts between a developer and community groups. And if those groups aren't around to hold a developer accountable, or the developer isn't around and there's no successor clause, and let's pause there. A successor clause would simply mean if a nonprofit went away, does someone else have the right to step in? And so we talked about that clause, right? And what was that language? Sole and absolute discretion of Facebook. There's little anyone else can do to enforce an agreement. And again, what did we talk about earlier? The government doesn't sign the contract. So you can't necessarily hold the government accountable through this agreement. Now you can do it in other ways, but not necessarily through the CBA. All right, there's something in the chat. Let's take a look. Okay, it says power, once you start thinking of voting blocks, is rarely as mathematically simple as percentages. It can be manipulated in hidden ways. Oh yeah, most definitely. And when we're honest with ourselves, when you have money and resources, you have people who are constantly thinking of ways to make benefits not happen, or in saying it another way, how do I increase my profit on this by not paying out, right? And what if I'm incentivized as a consultant, an attorney, a developer to incentivize keeping my clients' money? And so there are a lot of different tricky ways that even though the agreement may be good, right? Because there's the paper, then there's the practice, right? Like miles per gallon in the car. Yeah, it says one thing. We've all seen that, right? 30 miles, but then there's real world conditions that will dictate how much you actually get out of that car. The next one from Our Time Press, and this was about Atlantic Yards. Yet 1,900 of Barclays Arena's 2,000 jobs are part-time with no benefit. That's right, only 100 Barclay Arena jobs are full-time. According to a 2009 New York City Independent Budget Office report, the arena has received $750 million in direct and indirect funded subsidies. But the contrast is they're supposed to provide a lot of jobs, and the jobs that they provided were a lot of part-time jobs and no benefits. And I think the people that originally signed on to it, had they known that, probably would have put more stipulations in there and probably would have monitored and had different metrics saying, you know, if we're giving you this type of money, we think we want to know more about what your intentions are and how you plan to fulfill them, because having jobs that are simply jobs that might have been there but with no benefits, no living wages, that would become an issue for many community groups. And the last one, and as I referenced Julian Gross earlier, he's one of the guys that does a lot around community benefit agreements. In fact, his name was on the last CBA that we talked about. So let's read what he has to say. According to Julian Gross, a Bay Area attorney and expert on CBA negotiations, this sort of transfer of responsibility is exactly the kind of thing that can undermine these agreements, and is one of the hardest things to plan for. It's important to have an experienced attorney who can write a tight, enforceable contract with solid successors and assigns language. Even then, extracting the promised benefits from a new party can be a struggle for community groups who lose much of their political leverage once the CBA is finalized. So let's pause there. One of the things he's talking about is very often these developments go on. Sometimes developers run out of money, sometimes developers merge, sometimes developers are acquired. Then the question becomes, what is this new developer responsible for? Can we hold their feet to the fire if they say, hey, we reorganized, we were acquired? So Curtis Development is now Genesis Development. And Genesis Development, as we've talked to our lawyers, we don't have to abide by these things because there's no successor clause in this. And the last part, the successors who come in, they don't have a relationship with you, and they don't remember why the deal was cut at the front end. It's just an attachment to some document that they signed. Hopefully it's an attachment to some document they signed, says Gross, and now they don't need anything from you because the thing that was bargained for, giving up legal claims and political support, they already have it. Essentially, the horses are out of the barn. So the next part I want to talk a little bit about was how can a community prepare? And I think we've talked about some of these things. And this is where I think technology can come in. So do we have a list of community businesses that we can present to them that will have a motivation, that will have a public interest in continuing to see these things? Do we have a list of community consultants that can explain things to us carefully while some of our eyes glaze over, reading, a 20, 30-page document, attachment here, I looked this language up in a dictionary? Do we have a list of community organizations that we say represent us versus coming in and they say, hey, as some CBAs have actually had happen, I have a friend who is starting a nonprofit. I think they represent the community. And I'll get one other person over here. Hey, they represent your community. Stop talking to me. What about the labor force? What about evaluation of developers, right? What do we do when it's time to negotiate, but we haven't done our homework, or surprising us that someone else has already picked out every single component to fulfill the CBA without the actual community to be part of it? And so two of the resources I would love for you guys to take a look at is Action Tank USA. They have a really good toolkit that you can take a look at. Also, the Alliance TC, they're a group of both faith-based and non-faith-based community groups in Minnesota, and they have a really good PDF talking about the different things that they have achieved. Wrapping up as we get towards the end, one of the things that I want people to think about really was, how does the community prepare? Okay, I have something in the chat. Okay, can you give any examples of ways community groups or nonprofits have written successful CBAs that let the horse out of the barn so their agreement was fulfilled securely and longitudinally with the one doc? You know, I'd have to refer you to Alliance TC because it's really hard to talk. I think the Facebook one was pretty decent. They have done quite a bit. I have not seen a whole lot of criticism, so I would point to that one. There have been quite a few CBAs in Minnesota that I thought were decent. And so if you go to the Alliance TC, there are a number of CBAs that they've pointed out that you could take a look that I feel have been moderately successful. So getting back to this, one other things I would encourage people to do is to find gyms in your community. Do you have a group that's constantly looking for areas to develop? Let's say there's an abandoned school, or there was a former plant. Like with some of my clients, they do development, and we're constantly looking for ways to develop the community. So it's already part of our fabric that if let's say a plant shut down, what should we do with that plant? Let's not wait till someone else tells us what to do with that. It can be repurposed. Can you look at community financing? Because money is, again, a huge issue. Are there local banks? Are there local credit unions? Are there, people who have more money than they need to live on who are willing to put up the money to finance development? The next one is selecting the people who approve development. That's another key area that a lot of people don't think about, is who's actually approving this development? Is it the local city council? Is it a mayor? Have we talked to them about what we want to see developed so that they know if you bring in a certain type of developer, we may not be for it. But at the same time, we can be proactive in saying, hey, there are developers from the community, or there may be a developer from outside the community that has a great track record of working with communities. But I would also encourage starting a pipeline. There are some people out there that are already doing development, and my co-hosts who are going to be here, they do quite a bit of development on the north side of Minneapolis, and they've been looking for different ways to plug in people. And so I would certainly encourage people to look for developers, not just accept a developer that's coming in, but look for developers that you think would be favorable to your community. The next one, how would this work with respect to, say, infrastructure rather than specific building project, for example, rural broadband internet build out? That's actually a good question. But even with internet build out, you still have construction, towers, things like that, things that'll displace. So you would still have a CBA, and something like, let's say, a Comcast or a Cox, the benefit may be low income, free internet, or it could still be a job development. As those towers go up, who's going to be doing the construction for those? So that's where that would look a little bit different. So it may not be low-income housing, but it may be access to internet, it may be free computers, tablets, cell phones, and job development. So any other questions? If not, I will wrap up with some final thoughts. Change is only a good thing if you change in a good way. And I want people to keep that in mind, because moving in any direction isn't necessarily progress. And so as we think about development, what is it that the community needs to be better? And the last one, and I'll amend it to update it, a society grows great when elders plant trees whose shade they shall never, ever know and shall never sit in. I mean, think about that. What it's saying is, as you're doing development, you also have to look to future generations. As you plant those trees, the school, the tech center, the job workforce, the highway, the metro, the buses, so that people can get to work. This requires a long time and a pipeline to be able to do that. So thank you. And if you guys have any other questions, let me know. I am at my time.